You've heard of the places that whisper, haven't you? The ones that hold secrets like old lace. Well, I'm about to take you to one that's been hushed for centuries, Sainte-Croix, where the silence speaks louder than any scream. It's not just a building, it's a story. A story of madness, broken bodies, and a legacy that refuses to fade. You ever wonder what happens when a place holds too many secrets? The asylum of Sainte-Croix was once a place of hope, until the walls became prisons and the patients became prisoners. Now, they say the echoes of those lost still linger in the halls. But there's more than just ghosts here. There's a mystery that's been waiting for someone to listen. You ever feel like the past is trying to tell you something, but you just can't hear it? So, let's take a slow breath and step into the silence. What if the screams weren't heard, but felt? What if they're still here, waiting for someone to remember? You know, the asylum of Sainte-Croix wasn't always a place of suffering. It started as a quiet little convent, tucked away in the French countryside, where nuns tended to the sick and the poor. But the world changed, and so did the purpose of that sacred space. In 1815, the convent was taken over by the French government, and the nuns were sent away. The building was rebranded as a hospital, and then years later rebranded again as an asylum. They called it the Asylum of Sainte-Croix, but it was anything but saintly. The head doctor, Dr. Leonard Morel, was a man of science and cruelty. He believed that the mind could be cured through force, isolation, and a strict regimen of silence. And that silence? It became the true prison of Sainte-Croix. The asylum was known for its brutal treatments, chaining, electroshock, and the infamous restraint chair. But the real horror wasn't just in the methods, it was in the silence that followed, the screams that were never heard, and the stories that were never told. By the 1860s, the asylum had become infamous, a place where the sick were not healed but broken, and where the walls themselves seemed to whisper the secrets of those who had been silenced. You remember the first time you heard the whispers in the halls just before the lights flickered. It was like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to wake up. The nurses said it was just the wind, or maybe the old pipes groaning. But you could feel it like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment the silence would break. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and always just a little too slow. You'd look up, and the floorboards would be still, but the air would feel heavier, like the room had been waiting for you to notice. The staff started to leave in waves, some claiming they heard laughter in the dead of night, others saying the doors would open on their own, as if something had been waiting to be let out. And then, one by one, the patients disappeared. No records, no explanations, just the silence that followed, like the building had finally let out its breath. You see it now, don't you? The faint outline of a woman in the doorway, her silhouette trembling like candlelight. She's been here before, and she's waiting for someone to finally listen. This is where the screams stopped. The last recorded sound from Sainte-Croix. The nurses said she was never heard from again, but the walls remember. They still hum with the sound of her voice, if you know how to listen. They called her La Dame en Noir, the Black Lady. She was never officially recorded, but the staff whispered about her in hushed tones. Some say she was a patient, others say she was a nurse, or a ghost who never left. And then, one morning, she vanished. The doors were locked, the windows were sealed, and the last scream, well, it never came. But the silence was louder than any sound. You've heard the stories, but have you ever asked yourself what if the screams weren't just in the walls? What if they were in the silence? And what if, somewhere, the Black Lady is still waiting? I met a woman in Paris who claimed she saw the asylum at night, all windows glowing like sick eyes. She said the place looked like a child's drawing, but with too many rooms. She told me the walls still whisper in French, and that the air tastes like old blood and perfume. She said the asylum doesn't just haunt, it remembers. Another man, a former patient, said he heard the screams of the women who died there. He said they were not cries of pain, but of something deeper, like they were still trying to be heard. He told me the asylum is full of ghosts who never got to say goodbye. Some say they're still waiting for the people who left them behind to come back and listen. One woman, a journalist, said she found a journal in the attic. It was written in the 1930s, and every entry ended with the same sentence: "We are still here." She said the journal wasn't written by one person, it was a collective voice, like the asylum itself was trying to speak through them. We began our investigation with a simple question: what happened to those poor souls who vanished from Sainte-Croix? The silence was deafening, but the walls seemed to hum with secrets. We found names that had been erased from history. Each one carried a story, a life, a face, and a sudden, inexplicable disappearance. One name stood out: a woman who had been seen leaving the asylum the night before her disappearance. Her last known location was the old mill, now a ruin of rusted metal and ivy. We found her diary tucked behind a loose floorboard. The words were frantic, almost pleading, as if she had been trying to warn someone, but no one had listened. The final clue was a name written in the margins, one that hadn't appeared anywhere else. A name that no one remembered, but the walls of Sainte-Croix had not forgotten. You ever wonder what happens when a secret is too heavy to carry? That's what happened at Sainte-Croix. No one ever said what exactly was hidden in that sealed chamber beneath the chapel. The records say the chamber was sealed in 1872, right after the last patient was released. No one knew what was inside, just that it had to stay buried. Some say it was a body, others say it was a truth too dark to speak. No one ever found a way to open that door again, not even the ghost hunters who came after. And now, every time the wind howls through the chapel's broken windows, it sounds like someone is trying to scream and no one is listening. The thing is, no one really knows what's inside that room. Some say it's just a place where the pain of the past still lingers. Others say it's a prison for something that never left. And maybe that's the real curse, never knowing what you're truly afraid of. You know, some say the real horror of Sainte-Croix isn't the ghosts but the stories people tell to explain the silence. They say the walls remember and the stones whisper in tongues we don't understand. One local legend claims that the nuns used to bind the patients' mouths with silver thread so they couldn't scream. But now, the thread is said to still hum with the voices of the silenced. Some say the asylum's true curse is not the ghosts but the silence itself. Is silence so thick it feels like the building is holding its breath. And then there are the ones who say the screams are still here, not in the walls but in the wind, in the trees, in the way the moonlight glows too bright on certain nights. Some say if you stand in the garden at midnight, you can hear them, not in words but in a sound that makes your skin crawl, like the building is alive and remembering. There are some mysteries that refuse to die, even when the world moves on. The asylum of Sainte-Croix is one of them, and its story has no end, just more questions. Every year, new rumors surface, new voices ask, what if the truth is still out there? And every time, the silence answers back, louder than any scream. Some say the walls still remember, that the echoes of the lost still walk these halls. But do they walk, or do they wait? That's the question no one dares to answer. And so, the mystery lingers, as it always has. Like a whisper in the dark, it haunts the ones who dare to listen. Are you ready to hear the rest? You know, sometimes the most haunting places aren't the ones you expect. Like a quiet little town, or a forgotten room, where the silence is louder than any scream. The past doesn't stay buried, you see. It whispers through the cracks in the walls, through the wind, through the stories we're too polite to tell. So, as we wrap up this tale, I wonder, what's the one place that's been on your mind, that you've never dared to visit? Or perhaps, the one story that's been haunting you, just like the silence of Sainte-Croix. Now, before we move on, let me leave you with this. The next story may not be as quiet, but it will be just as real. Are you ready for it? You've heard of the haunted hospitals, the silent screams, the places where the walls don't just echo but whisper. But have you ever heard of the asylum of Sainte-Croix? Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Kindle Paperwhite e-reader. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. Nestled in the rolling hills of the Loire Valley, this place was once a beacon of hope for the sick and the lost. Now it's a ruin, a place where the air feels heavier and the silence is too loud. Legends say that the walls of Sainte-Croix still echo with the voices of those who suffered there. Some say they hear laughter, others weeping. But one sound is always the same, screaming. The asylum's built in the 1800s, but its history runs deeper than the stones beneath your feet. It was a place of healing, but also of fear, and now, it's a place where the past refuses to stay buried. So, what do you think? Is it the wind that whispers through the trees, or something far more sinister? I'm just saying, when you hear the screaming, you might want to run. You know, the asylum of Sainte-Croix wasn't always a place of despair. It started in the early 1600s when a group of monks in France decided they needed a place to care for the mentally ill without the stigma of the streets. They called it a house of mercy, a place where the broken could find peace. But soon, the walls began to echo with cries that weren't just from the patients. By the 1700s, the asylum had become a place of fear. The patients were kept in cells, fed through a slot in the door, and left alone for days at a time. The air was thick with the scent of fear and decay. And it wasn't just the patients who suffered. The monks themselves began to hear the screams in the night. Some claimed they could see shadows moving in the corridors, though no one was there. By the time the asylum was abandoned in the 1800s, its name had become synonymous with horror. But even then, the screams didn't stop. They just grew quieter, waiting for someone to listen. You remember the first time you heard the whispers? They came from the stone walls, low and laced with something like a sob. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either, just enough to make your skin crawl and your heart race. They said it was just the wind, but the wind doesn't cry. And the walls didn't just whisper, they hummed, like a deep, mournful song that seemed to rise from the bones of the building itself. They tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a trick of the mind. But the walls didn't just whisper, they remembered. And they never forgot. And then, one night, the walls screamed. Not in a way that could be explained. Just a sound so raw and real, it made your soul ache. You knew then that something had been waiting, and it wasn't done yet. You remember the whispers, don't you? That faint, almost musical hum that creeps through the stone like a secret. It was there the night they vanished, just after the moon turned blood red. The nurses said it was the wind, but the wind didn't hum. It didn't hum in the same key, and it didn't stop when the doors were locked. It just got louder, like someone was singing along. They never found her, but the walls kept singing. Some said it was her voice, others that she was still inside, trapped between the pain and the silence. But the sound didn't stop. The next night, the sound changed. It wasn't a hum anymore, it was a scream. A sound that cut through the silence like a knife, and no one could say where it came from. And then, the walls stopped. Not a moment too soon, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream, and it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. I remember the way the wind would whistle through those old stone corridors, like it was trying to carry a message no one was willing to hear. The asylum was always quiet, but the walls had a voice of their own. One night, a nurse claimed she heard a child's laughter coming from the basement, but when she went to check, the door was locked from the inside. She knocked, and the laughter stopped. Then the silence was louder than the sound. A doctor who once worked there told me that the worst part wasn't the screams. It was the way they'd stop mid-scream, like something had grabbed them and dragged them away. No one ever knew what happened to them. There were even rumors that the walls would whisper to the night staff, that they'd talk to you if you listened closely enough, and they'd tell you things you weren't supposed to know. And if you listened too long, you'd start to hear them. Not just the screams, but the stories. The ones that were never meant to be told. We started with the old records, dusty and brittle. The ink faded like the memories they held. The staff said they found a pattern, a whisper in the silence, a sound that wasn't quite a sound at all. The nurses' logs mentioned a low, keening wail that came from the east wing at night. It didn't match any patient's voice, and no one could say for sure if it was real or just the wind through the broken windows. We checked the wiring, the plumbing, the old heating system. Nothing seemed to be broken, but something was wrong with the air. It felt like the walls were breathing, like they were holding their breath before a scream. Then there were the footprints, not in the mud or the snow, but in the dust on the floorboards. They were small, and they always led toward the east wing, as if someone or something was being drawn there. We tried to rationalize it all: wind, imagination, old superstition. But there was something about the way the walls seemed to listen, like they knew exactly when to scream and when to stay silent. You know, there's one thing that's always bugged me about the asylum of Sainte-Croix. No one ever explains what exactly the walls were screaming. Some say it was the voices of the patients trapped inside their minds. Others think it was the sound of the building itself, crying out in pain. But no one ever says what the screams actually sounded like. Was it a cry of terror, or a cry of anguish, or maybe something else entirely? And that's the thing, isn't it? The mystery of the scream. It's not just the walls that are haunted, it's the silence that follows them. Some say the walls don't just echo the past, they scream it. You've heard the stories, but have you ever wondered what it was like to be there, hearing the whispers of the lost? Local legends say the spirits of the patients still roam these halls, their voices trapped in the stone, crying out for release. Some say they're not ghosts at all, but echoes of a time when the walls were built to silence them. Theories abound. Some say it was the sound of chains, others the cries of the broken. A few say the walls are still listening, waiting for someone to finally speak back. But what if the screams weren't just from the patients? What if they were the voices of the keepers, the doctors, the ones who locked them away and never let them go? It's easy to romanticize the past, but some say the walls don't forgive. They remember. They hiss with the weight of secrets that were never meant to be heard. You've heard the whispers, but the truth is still trapped in the silence. No one knows what happened that night in 1923, and the walls still remember. Who was that woman, and why did she never leave? The last official report was sealed away, but the records are missing. Some say it was a cover-up, others say the truth was too dark to face. What if the real story is still hidden in the silence? The walls still echo with the sound of a scream that never ended. Some say it's the voice of a lost soul, others say it's the sound of a secret that refuses to die. What if the asylum is still waiting for someone to listen? No one has ever found the body, and no one has ever found the truth. This story isn't over, it's just waiting for someone to pick up the pieces. What would you do if the scream was still out there, just waiting for you? You know, sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones that never quite finish. Like the walls of Sainte-Croix, whispering secrets they never meant to share. And you wonder what if the screams you hear are not from the past, but from somewhere much closer. So, as we turn the page, remember that the most terrifying stories are the ones we can't quite put to rest. Now, let's step into the next tale, one that waits just beyond the edge of the light. You've heard the whispers of the asylum of Sainte-Croix, haven't you? A place where the walls once held more than just patience, they held pain, secrets, and the echoes of despair. Nestled in the outskirts of a forgotten French village, it stood for over a century, a place where the desperate and the mad were sent to disappear into silence. It wasn't just the architecture that made it eerie, it was the stories. Stories of screams that echoed through the night, of doctors who disappeared, and of patients who vanished without a trace. Even now, decades later, the locals say you can still hear the whispers of the lost just outside the gates, just before the dawn. So, what do you think? Was it the madness that lived there, or the madness that lived in the people who once called it home? You know, the asylum of Sainte-Croix didn't start as a place of suffering. It was once a grand, if slightly eccentric, medical institution, built in the early 1800s by a French physician named Etienne Dufresne. He believed in the power of reason and restraint, not chains and madness. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something to enjoy, take a look at the Amazon Echo Dub smart speaker. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. Dufresne brought in a team of doctors, nurses, and even a few philosophers to help treat the mentally ill. It was meant to be a place of healing, not punishment. Or so they thought. There were rumors of patients being locked in dark cells, of doctors trying to cure madness with ice baths and electric shocks. Some say the asylum became a place where the truly mad were made. By the turn of the century, the asylum had become a symbol of both hope and horror. It was a place where people sought refuge, but also where they feared to stay. And that's where the real story begins. You remember how it all started, don't you? A few months before the first whispers of the asylum's ghosts, the place was just a place. A building that had seen better days, but still stood tall like a weary old woman who'd outlived her time. The staff called it the quiet place, not because it was peaceful, but because it was so still. You could hear the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of paper in the nurses' offices, and the occasional sigh of a patient who had long since stopped breathing. It wasn't long before the patients began to notice. One of the younger ones, a boy named Pierre, started hearing voices in the night. He'd wake up to find his bed sheets soaked with cold sweat and his hands trembling like he'd just run a race. And then, one by one, the staff began to vanish. First the janitor, then the head nurse, and finally the doctor. No one knew where they went, but the place did. The asylum became quieter than ever, as if it had finally let out its breath. So, what do you think? Was it the asylum, or was it the people who had lived there? And if you had been there, would you have heard it too? Or would you have thought it was just the wind? You remember the whispers, don't you? The ones that echoed through the stone corridors like a child's cry in the dark. But that was just the beginning of the real terror. One night, the screams stopped. Not just the whispers, but the sound of the world itself. The nurses said it was a silence so thick, it pressed against your ribs. The next morning, they found her, not in the cell, but in the garden, her hands tied to a tree, her eyes open and unblinking, as if she had been waiting for someone to finally listen. They never found the key. Not in the cell, not in her pockets, not in the garden. Just her, and the silence that followed like a shadow no one could shake. I've spoken to dozens of people who claim to have heard the screams from Sainte-Croix. One woman said they woke up in the middle of the night to a sound like a child sobbing, only to find her cat staring at the wall, eyes wide and unblinking. Another man swore the screams came from the basement of his old family home, which he said was built on the very spot where the asylum once stood. He said the sound was so real, he reached for a flashlight only to find the door was locked from the inside. There's even a story about a school teacher who claimed to hear the screams every night for weeks. She said they got louder until one night she heard a voice call her name. When she turned, there was no one there, just the echo of her own fear. These accounts are more than just whispers, they're the kind of stories that stay with you. They don't just tell you what happened, they remind you that something still lives there, waiting for the right moment to be heard. We started with the basics: maps, records, and old photographs. The first thing we noticed was how much of Sainte-Croix had been erased from official history. It was like the place had been swallowed by time itself, leaving only whispers behind. The deeper we dug, the more we found stories that didn't quite fit. Nurses spoke of patients who vanished without a trace, and the record showed no mention of them. It was as if they'd never existed at all. Then there were the sounds: soft, rhythmic, and always at night. We heard them in the old recordings, a heartbeat that never matched the clock, and in the silence between the echoes of the past. One thing became clear: Sainte-Croix wasn't just haunted. It was holding on to something that refused to let go. And it wasn't just the ghosts of the patients, it was the guilt of the people who left them behind. You know, there's one thing about the Sainte-Croix that's never made sense. Every ghost story, every whisper, every shadow, it all leads to that one moment. But no one can tell you what happened. The nurses said they heard it every night. It sounds so precise, so sharp, it stopped the world. Not a scream, not a cry, it was something else entirely. Now, I've heard the stories of the lighthouse before, but this wasn't just a patient gone missing. It was a disappearance that didn't fit the pattern. No clues, no body, just silence. And that's the thing. No one ever got to the bottom of it. Not the doctors, not the priests, not even the ones who stayed behind. It just stopped, like the whole place had been forgotten. So, what do you think? Was it a ghost, a trick of the mind, or something older than the asylum itself? You've heard the stories, but let's talk about the people who still believe. There's a local legend that the screams are not just echoes of the past, but the cries of a woman who never left. Some say the asylum was built on a cursed patch of earth, where the bones of the old French saints still whisper secrets to the living. Others believe it's not the dead who are screaming, but the living, those who once worked there and still feel the weight of their guilt. And then there are the tourists, the thrill seekers, who come just to hear the stories, but sometimes they hear something else, something that doesn't belong to the past. So, what do you think? Are we listening to the ghosts, or are they listening to us? You know, sometimes the most haunting echoes aren't from the past, but from the present. The asylum of Sainte-Croix still stands and still whispers. Have you ever wondered if it's waiting for someone to finally listen? The doors have been sealed for decades, but the rumors persist. Some say the wind carries voices through the cracks. Others claim the walls still hum with the memory of screams that never ended. No one has stepped inside since the last caretaker vanished. He left behind only a journal, filled with frantic scribbles about things he couldn't explain. Did he find peace, or did he become part of the silence? The police say it was a suicide. The locals say it was a haunting. But I say it's just the beginning. What if the asylum isn't done with us yet? What if it's waiting for you to finally hear what it has to say? You've heard the whispers, felt the chill, and now you're left with the question that lingers like the scent of old perfume. What if the screams we hear aren't just echoes of the past, but warnings for the future? There's something about these places, these old, forgotten spaces, that seem to hold their own secrets. They don't just remember the dead, they remember the living who dared to listen. And as you leave, you might find yourself glancing over your shoulder, not because you're afraid, but because you know you're not alone in this story. So, before we move on, take a moment to breathe. These tales are not just for the thrill of the spooky, but for the deeper truth they reveal about us and our own hidden fears. Now, with that quiet moment behind us, let's turn the page and see what other ghosts have been waiting in the wings. You've heard of Paris, but have you ever wondered what lies beneath the city's elegant streets? Beneath the Seine, beneath the cobblestone avenues, there's a place where the air feels heady and the silence is too loud. These tunnels, called the catacombs, were once a burial ground for the city's dead. They stretch for miles, carved into the ancient rock beneath Paris. But they're not just bones and dust, they're whispers. Some say the catacombs are haunted by the souls of the forgotten. Others say they're just the echoes of a city that never stops dreaming. But one thing is certain: those who go and rarely come out the same. In the 19th century, the catacombs were discovered by a young man named Henriquel. He was the first to walk the tunnels and describe the silence, the cold, and the whispers that rose from the stones like a lullaby. Today, the catacombs are a place of pilgrimage, but for many, they remain a mystery. Some say the whispers are just the wind. Others say they're the voices of the dead, still waiting to be heard. You know, the catacombs didn't start as a graveyard. They were once a place of hope, a secret way to bury the poor and the forgotten. Imagine a Paris that was still finding its way, where the city's bones were still growing. Back in the 1700s, the city was overcrowded and the church couldn't keep up. So, the French Revolution's chaos gave birth to a new kind of burial. They started digging beneath the streets, turning the city's own bones into a place of refuge. The first people buried there were the poor, the sick, and the outcasts. They were given a place to rest, away from the eyes of the world. But as the city grew, so did the demand for space, and the catacombs became more than a burial ground. Over time, the catacombs became a secret place for the city's hidden lives. Some say they were used for illegal burials, others for hiding treasures, and even for secret meetings. But for many, they were a place of peace, a final resting spot beneath the city's chaos. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Fire TV Stick 4K streaming device. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. And so, the catacombs were born not as a place of horror, but as a place of quiet dignity. A space where the forgotten found a home, and where the city's past still whispers through the stones. You remember the first time you heard it, just a whisper, like the wind through an old church window. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something old and waiting. People dismissed it at first. A trick of the ears, they said, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a voice trying to reach through the walls of the world. They called her a madwoman, but she didn't stop. She told them about the voices, the cold spots, the way the air would still when she passed. And she said the whispers were not for her, they were for the next one. And then she vanished. No trace, no body, just a silence that felt too loud, like the world had taken a breath and never exhaled. One night in 1897, a young seamstress named Marie disappeared without a trace. Her last known words were a whisper of "they're coming for me," and that's when the real horror began. Her landlord claimed she'd gone to visit a relative, but no one could find her. The only clue was a torn piece of her apron found near the entrance of the catacombs, stained with something dark and wet. Her mother claimed she had seen shadows moving in the tunnels and heard voices calling her name in a language she didn't know. The last time she was seen, she was alone, walking toward the mouth of the catacombs. No body was ever found, but since that night, the catacombs have been said to whisper her name in the wind, and those who wandered too deep often return with stories of a pale woman in a blue dress, calling for help. Some say Marie was never lost at all, just waiting for the right moment to come home and to finally be heard. I've spoken to several Parisians who say they've heard the whispers in the catacombs. One woman, a retired school teacher, told me she once followed the sound of a child's laughter down into the tunnels, only to find herself alone in the dark, the laughter echoing behind her. Another man, a former sewer worker, claimed he once saw a woman in a white dress standing at the edge of the passage, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. He said he turned away before he could see her clearly. There's also the story of a young couple who said they were lost in the catacombs one night, and when they finally found their way out, they swore they saw a figure in the distance, walking toward them, but when they reached the surface, there was no one there. One of the most unsettling accounts came from a nun who once led a group of pilgrims through the catacombs. She said she heard a voice calling her name, soft and familiar, but when she turned, there was no one there. She said the voice had the same tone as a long-lost friend. These stories don't have answers, but they do have a weight. You've heard the whispers, but have you ever wondered if they're calling for you? We began by tracing the catacombs' origins, and what we found was more than bones and history. It was a web of secrets. The Parisian authorities had long buried the truth, but we uncovered records of a 19th-century burial scandal. The records spoke of a mass grave beneath the city's oldest church, a place where the dead had been moved and hidden for political reasons. It was a crime buried with the bodies. Then there was the local legend, whispers of a priest who had once led the burial, only to vanish without a trace. His name was never recorded, but his shadow seemed to linger in the catacombs. As we delved deeper, we found that the catacombs were not just a place of death, but of memory. The walls were etched with names, dates, and prayers, each a silent plea from the past. And then there was the sound, soft, like a voice calling from the stone itself. It was never the same, never clear, but it always seemed to follow us, as if the past was trying to speak. We left with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the catacombs were not just a graveyard. They were a place where the past refused to stay buried. You know, the real mystery isn't the whispers or the cold. It's the one detail that's always been left out: the exact date of the first recorded death in the catacombs. No one can agree on when it happened. Some say 1780, others claim it was 1793. But the official records? They're missing that very first entry. It's like the catacombs themselves are protecting that secret. Or maybe someone didn't want the truth to be known. So the question remains, was it a mistake, a cover-up, or something more natural? You don't have to know the answer, but you'll never forget the question. You've heard the stories, but some locals swear the catacombs are alive with more than just bones. They say the whispers aren't just echoes of the past, they're warnings. A local historian once told me that in the 1800s, some Parisians believed the catacombs were a sacred place, not just a tomb. They left offerings, thinking the dead might guide them. Others believe the catacombs are just a place where the city's sorrow lingers. Every time someone dies in Paris, the whispers grow louder, like the city itself is crying. And there's always the theory that the catacombs were built by the French Revolution, and the dead are still waiting for their leaders to rise again. A revolutionary ghost, perhaps. But no one can say for sure. All we have are whispers and a city that never sleeps. So when you walk through the streets of Paris, Do you ever hear the voices beneath the cobblestones? You know, some mysteries don't get solved, some just fade. And yet, the catacombs keep whispering, as if waiting for someone to finally listen. The last official search for the missing girl ended in 1945, but the police said it was a suicide. That doesn't stop the bones from still being found, or the voices from still being heard. The city has moved on, the catacombs have not. And if you listen closely, just before dawn, you might hear the echo of a voice calling for help still and forever unanswered. So, if you're ever in Paris and you feel that tug in your chest, the one that says, "I know this place," follow it. Just don't follow it alone. You've heard the whispers, felt the chill of the past, and stood where shadows speak. But remember, the truest horrors are not always the ones we see. The catacombs may be silent now, but their stories linger in the bones of the city, waiting for the right heart to listen. So let's not say goodbye, but rather, let's say until next time, dear listener. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a new story to tell, and it's not one you'll want to miss. You've heard of the Great Lakes, but have you ever wondered what lies beneath their still, glassy surface? The SS Eastland was more than a ship, it was a symbol of Chicago's rise until it vanished in a single, terrible night. Built in 1915, the Eastland was a sleek, grand passenger ship, built for the wealthy and the brave. But it wasn't just the city that grew, it was the ship itself, swelling with passengers, cargo, and the weight of its own ambition. The night of the disaster, the Eastland was heading back to Chicago from a day of festivities. But the calm was deceptive. The ship was full, and the weather was changing. One moment, a floating palace. The next, a ghost ship. The SS Eastland sank in minutes, taking over 800 lives with it. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. But what's left of the ship now is just a memory, a warning, and a question. What lingers in the water beneath the surface? And now, as we gather around the fire, we ask, what stories does the Eastland still hold? What secrets does the river whisper to those who listen closely enough? So, the SS Eastland wasn't just any ship, it was a proud, bustling passenger liner, full of people heading to a brighter future. But on that fateful day in 1915, it wasn't the water that claimed them, it was the very era they were in. Built in 1907, the Eastland was a marvel of its time, fast, luxurious, and built for the American dream. But its fate was sealed in the design choices that made it more than just a ship. On the morning of the disaster, the Eastland was leaving Chicago, loaded with people and cargo. But it wasn't the weight that sank it, it was the way the water came in, silently and swiftly. The tragedy wasn't just about the ship, it was about the people who trusted it, who believed in progress, and who were caught in the cruel irony of their own hopes. And though the Eastland is gone, its memory lingers in the water, in the stories of those who lived and died on its decks, and in the quiet, unspoken warnings that still echo from its watery grave. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. You remember how the air felt that morning, thick and heavy, like the sky was holding its breath, the kind of calm that always precedes a storm. And then, the first flicker of something wrong, a tremor in the water, like the ship had just woken from a long, restless sleep. The crew noticed it first, a strange stillness in the air, like the ship had forgotten how to move. Then came the whispers, the hushed conversations in the engine room. Something wasn't right, but no one knew what. Not yet. The radio crackled with static, and then a voice, distant, urgent. A warning, maybe, or a plea. No one could tell. It was like the ship itself was trying to speak, but the words had been swallowed by the silence. Then came the first real sign, a door that wouldn't close, a stairwell that led nowhere, a deck that felt lighter than it should. The ship was changing, like it was becoming something else, something that didn't belong to the world anymore. And still, no one dared to say what they were feeling. They were too polite, too afraid. But deep down, they all knew something had been wrong for a long time, and it was only just beginning. You can almost hear the water lapping against the hull as the Eastland sets sail, a grand affair with families and children laughing and dancing on the deck, unaware of the tragedy that awaits. Then, without warning, the ship tilts. A sudden lurch, a gasp from the crowd, and the world tilts on its axis. The laughter fades into screams, and the water rises like a ghost from the depths. In the chaos, bodies are flung into the water, and the ship begins to sink. Some try to climb back on board, others are pulled under by the current. The once vibrant ship becomes a graveyard in the making. The final moments are a blur of screams, cries for help, and the sound of the ship groaning as it goes down. Some manage to escape, but many are lost to the dark waters of the Chicago River. In the end, the Eastland is gone, but its story lingers. A ship once full of life and laughter, now a silent monument to the tragedy that unfolded in a single, fateful moment. Some survivors recall the ship groaning like a wounded beast, its iron bones creaking as if it were alive. One man said he heard a voice low, urgent, calling from the water. Another swore he saw a figure in the water, dressed in a long, dark coat, reaching up as if trying to grab the railing. But when he looked again, there was nothing. One survivor said the air was thick with a metallic scent like blood and rust, and that the water seemed to pull at their legs, urging them to stay. Even the most rational among them couldn't explain why the ship's bell stopped ringing mid-chorus, and the crew's last cry was swallowed by the dark. These stories, though fragmented, all point to something more than just a disaster, something that lingers, waiting for the right moment to speak. You know, the investigation into the Eastland was like peeling back layers of a long-forgotten mystery. They dug into every log, every name, every whisper of what happened that day. They found the ship's log, but it was like reading a story that had been rewritten. Some entries were missing, and others were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. Then there were the testimonies. Some were so vivid, they made you feel the heat of the Chicago summer, the smell of sweat and salt water on the breeze. But others told stories that didn't match. Some said the ship was calm, others said it was rocking like a drunk sailor. It was like the truth had been swallowed by the river itself. The most unsettling part? They found no bodies, just the wreckage, the names on the list, and the silence of the story that refused to be told. There's one thing about the Eastland that has never been explained, and it's the simplest thing: why the ship didn't sink in the first place. It was built to float, and it did. For years, it floated across the Chicago River like a gentle giant, carrying people and cargo with ease. They had packed the ship full to the brim, not with cargo, but with people, over 3,000 of them, all crammed into one place, all in one moment. And yet, no one seems to know why the Eastland didn't just sit there, waiting to be pushed over the edge. Was it the weight? The angle of the river? Or was it something else entirely, something no one could explain? That one detail, that one question still lingers, like the echo of a scream in the dark. You've heard the name, but have you ever wondered what the Eastland really looked like? Some say it was a sleek, white ship with a grand promenade, like a floating ballroom on Lake Michigan. Others claim it was a hulking beast, a steel monster that swallowed the city whole. Local legends say the ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a stage for a midnight dance, a place where love and tragedy collided. Some say the ghost of the ship still hums a waltz, a sad reminder of what was lost. Others whisper that the Eastland wasn't just lost to the water, it was lost to the sky. Some say the ship was never meant to sail, that it was cursed by the very city it served. You've heard the stories, but have you ever wondered what the city itself remembers? There's a theory that the ship was haunted from the start, that its very steel was cursed by the people it left behind. Some say the ghost of the Eastland still waits for the city to remember it, to apologize for the lives it took. And then there are those who say the Eastland never sank at all, that it still floats somewhere in the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise again. That it's not a ship, it's a spirit, and it's never leaving. You know, sometimes the most haunting things aren't the ghosts, but the questions that remain unanswered. What if the Eastland story isn't over? What if it's waiting for someone to finally listen? Every year on April 27th, the city remembers the lost. But the mystery, it still lingers, like a ghost in the fog, refusing to let go of the riverbank. And what if the real story of the Eastland isn't just about a ship that sank? What if it's about the people who lived, loved, and died in the shadow of progress? What if it's about the silence that followed? So here's the thing, dear listener, the Eastland story isn't over. It's just waiting for someone to pick up the thread and follow it to the end. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is you. You know, sometimes the ghosts aren't the ones who vanish, they're the ones who stay behind, whispering secrets in the wind, waiting for someone to listen. And sometimes, the only thing left behind is a name, a story, and the echo of a ship that never made it home. So, as we turn the page, let's not forget that the past is never truly gone, it just waits, quietly, for the right moment to whisper again. And now, let's gather round the fire and hear the next tale where the dark is deep and the truth is buried. You've heard of the Carlsbad Caverns, those glowing, otherworldly caves in New Mexico. But what if I told you they were once a crime scene? A place where history and horror collided in a way that still lingers in the silence. This isn't just any cave, it's a labyrinth of stone, a place where light bends and time feels suspended. And yet, there's something about it that feels watched. Like the walls themselves remember what happened here. Now, decades later, the caves are a tourist destination, but the locals know better. There are whispers of voices in the dark, of footsteps that don't belong, and of a ghostly presence that lingers just out of sight. But why would a place so beautiful and serene also feel so heavy with sorrow? What secrets are buried in these rocks, and who or what still calls this place home? As we step deeper into this story, we'll uncover the truth behind the forgotten massacre of the Carlsbad Caverns. But first, let's remember some places don't forget, and some stories are best told by candlelight. You know, the Carlsbad Caverns weren't always a tourist trap. They were once a secret hideout for a very dangerous group of men, outlaws, smugglers, and eventually killers. And they had a name that would echo through these dark caves for decades. These men were led by a man named James Mad Dog Murphy, a man who made his name not with gold, but with blood. He was a leader, a gambler, and a man who knew how to make a living in the lawless West. The conflict escalated, and so did the violence. One night, Murphy's men took a group of ranchers hostage. Not knowing that the ranchers were carrying more than just supplies, they were carrying a secret that Murphy was desperate to keep. That secret? A stash of gold. Gold that had been hidden by a long-dead miner, and gold that Murphy believed belonged to him. But the ranchers had no intention of letting it fall into the wrong hands. What happened next is a story that's been told and retold, but never confirmed. One thing is certain, the gold was never found, and the men who took it were never seen again. And the caves, they remember. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Apple AirPods 2nd generation. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. You remember the sky that day, don't you? A heavy, brooding gray, like the weight of the world had settled over the land. The air was thick, and the silence felt like it had been waiting for something to break. The miners had gone in early, just before the storm. They were in a hurry, but not for the usual reasons. They said the air felt different, like it was holding its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. The next morning, they found the first body. Not a scream, not a struggle, just a man, lying still, as if he had simply stopped breathing. His face was calm, but his eyes were open, staring into the dark like he was waiting for someone to come back. They tried to call it a freak accident, but the stories started spreading. Some said the cave had a spirit, others that the men had disturbed something ancient. But no one could explain why the silence had turned into a scream, and no one could explain why the silence had never stopped. And that's when the real silence began. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from something that's still here, still watching, still waiting. You've heard the whispers of the Carlsbad Caverns, but what if the real horror isn't in the dark? What if it's in the silence? You ever wonder what happens when a place is too quiet? In 1923, a group of spelunkers vanished into the depths. No tracks, no sounds, just a cave that swallowed them whole. You think about that, don't you? What would you do if you heard the echo of footsteps in a cave that hadn't been used in years? They went in for the thrill of adventure, but what if the cave didn't want them to leave? You ever think about how a place can hold secrets so deep? They're not just in the stone, they're in the air, in the silence, in the way the wind doesn't blow through there anymore. The search for them turned into a search for truth. You wonder, what if the cave wasn't just empty, it was waiting? What if it had been waiting for them all along? They never found the bodies, but they found something else. A message carved into the stone, in a language no one could understand. You think about that. What if the cave wasn't just haunted, it was trying to tell them something? And now, every time the wind shifts, every time the silence stretches too long, you can hear it again. A whisper, a footstep, a breath. Just like they did. Just like they never came back. Some say the caverns whisper the names of those who vanished. Others claim they hear laughter echoing through the stone. But one man, a cave guide from 1934, swore he saw shadows moving where no one should be. He described figures with no faces, their hands outstretched like they were trying to reach for something or someone. He said the air grew colder the deeper he went, and the silence was too heavy to bear. Another survivor, a woman who was just 12 at the time, claimed she saw a man fall into the darkness. She never saw his face, but she heard him scream, a sound that still haunts the stories passed down in these parts. The official records say nothing about the screams, nothing about the shadows, just a list of names and a date. But the people who live near the caverns know better. They say the stone remembers. So when the caves reopen, some say the echoes will return too. Some say they always have. And if you listen closely, you might hear them calling your name. We followed the old trail markers through the canyon, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something older, something that clung to the walls like a memory. The silence was so deep it felt like it had been waiting for us. At the edge of the cavern entrance, we found a rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. Inside were old photographs, yellowed and brittle, of people who had once stood where we now stood, their faces frozen in a look of quiet terror. We dug deeper, uncovering a map and a journal, both written in a hurried, frantic hand. The entries spoke of strange sounds in the dark, of a group that never returned, of a place that swallowed them whole. One entry, dated the day before the last disappearance, was written in red ink. It read, "We hear them. They're not gone. They're waiting. And they know who we are." We left the site with more questions than answers, the air heavy with the weight of something unseen, something that had been here long before we arrived, and would remain long after we left. You know, the one thing that's never been explained is why the bodies were found with their hands clasped over their faces. It's like they were trying to protect something, or maybe they were trying to hide the truth from the world. No one knows if it was a ritual, a message, or just the last, desperate act of someone who felt they had nothing left to lose. But the way they were placed, it's almost like they were waiting for someone to come back and see what they'd done. The caves have seen a lot, but this is a mystery that lingers, like the echo of a whisper in the dark. You can almost hear it, just at the edge of your hearing, saying, "Come closer, there's something you need to know." And so the caves keep their secret, guarding the truth like a mother who won't let her children go. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the passageways, it sounds like a voice calling out, "Help us, we're still here." Some say the real tragedy began with a wrong turn. Others claim it was a lost map, or a moment of panic in the dark. But the stories all agree on one thing: no one who went into the caves that night ever came out. In the quiet town of Carlsbad, the elders still tell of the last tour, a group of 10 led by a guide who vanished without a trace. The caves never told their story, but the silence left a lot to imagine. Theories range from cave-in to disease to something more sinister. Some say the caves swallowed them whole. Others whisper that the victims were never found, only the silence and the cold, dark, waiting stone. To this day, people still walk those tunnels, and some say they hear whispers in the dark. A child's laugh, a woman's voice calling for help. The caves, they say, are still waiting to tell their story. But the caves don't speak in words. They speak in silence. In the way the wind moves through the rock, in the echo of a step, in the way the darkness clings to you like a memory you can't quite remember. You see, the mystery hasn't just faded with time, it's grown colder, sharper, like a knife buried in the dark. No one's ever found the bodies. No one's ever found the truth. They say the caves whisper, but no one's ever heard them speak. Just silence, and the echo of footsteps that don't belong to anyone. We've searched, we've questioned, we've listened, but the caves never answer. And that's what makes this one so very, very quiet. So I ask you, dear listener, what would you do if the place you loved had forgotten its own name? Would you keep searching, or would you let the silence take you? The mystery lingers, not because it's solved, but because it's still waiting. Waiting for someone to hear it, to listen, to remember. You know, sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest echoes, like these caverns, where silence is not emptiness, but a presence waiting to be heard. We came seeking ghosts, but maybe what we found was something older, something that never left. The past doesn't always stay buried, and as you leave, remember, the caverns don't forget. They only wait for the right moment to remind you. So, before we go on, what do you think lingers in the dark? A story, a memory, or something that's still here? Stay curious, stay quiet, and maybe stay a little afraid. You've heard of the Carlsbad Caverns, those glowing wonders deep in New Mexico. But what if I told you there's a darker story hidden in the rock, one that's been whispered about for decades, like a ghost in the limestone? It's not just the caves that draw people, and it's the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just fall, but lands on you like a heavy blanket. You can almost hear the echoes of something that never should have been there. You know, the Carlsbad Caverns weren't always a place of wonder, they were once a place of terrible, terrible business. Back in the 1920s, this was a mining town, and the caves were filled with more than just rock and minerals. The miners were mostly Mexican and Mexican-American, working long hours for little pay. They called the caves La Cueva de los Muertos, the Cave of the Dead. But they weren't just digging for minerals, they were digging for survival. On the night of the massacre, the mine was locked down. Miners were dragged out of their homes, beaten, and some were shot. The bodies were buried in the tunnels, hidden from the world. The caves, once a place of life, became a graveyard. The massacre was never officially acknowledged. The town moved on. The caves were turned into a tourist attraction, and the truth was buried along with the bodies. But the caves still remember. They still whisper. And that's how it began. A place of beauty turned into a place of blood. A history that's been forgotten, but never forgiven. And now, as we walk deeper into these caves, we're not just exploring, we're confronting the past. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. You remember the last time we spoke, didn't you? We were just beginning to unravel the threads of what happened in Carlsbad Caverns. But something changed in the days that followed. The first sign came in the form of a missing hiker, just like the others. No trail, no signal, no trace. The rangers called it a mysterious disappearance, but we all knew it wasn't mysterious at all. Then the radio started acting up. Static, garbled voices, and a strange, low hum that seemed to come from the caverns themselves. The rangers tried to ignore it, but it grew louder every night. People began to hear things, whispers in the dark, footsteps in empty halls, the sound of a child laughing when no one was around. Some said it was just the wind, but others knew better. And then the silence. No more radio static, no more whispers, just the weight of something that had been waiting longer than anyone had realized. You remember the air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the whisper of unseen things. It was 1921 and the caverns were quiet, but something had changed. The silence was too deep, too heavy. 5 men, all local, all trusted, entered the caves for a simple tour. They had no idea what they were walking into. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to hold its breath. No bodies were found, no clues, just silence where there should have been voices. The caves became a place of whispered warnings and unanswered questions. To this day, the caves are still watched. Some say the wind carries their voices. Others say the silence is louder than any sound. But the truth, that's what we're still trying to find. One survivor, a young woman named Clara, said the air turned to ice when the screams started. She swore the walls of the cave were whispering, not in words, but in a sound like 1,000 fingers scraping against stone. Another hiker, John, claimed he saw a figure in the dark, tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes and moving like smoke. He tried to call out, but his voice just echoed back to him, hollow. Some say the cave still hums with the memory of that night, and that if you listen closely, you can hear the voices of the lost no longer screaming, but singing a lullaby in a language no one understands. It's said the cave doesn't just remember, it waits. And if you step too far in, it might just call you back, with a voice that sounds like your own, and a song that's been waiting a long time to be sung. The first thing the investigators found was a rusted can of beans, half buried in the sand. It had been there for decades, untouched, like a time capsule of a forgotten life. Then there was the old mining map, tucked into the wall of a collapsed tunnel. The ink had faded, but the hand-drawn symbols still whispered of a path that led nowhere. The most unsettling discovery was the old lantern, still hanging from the ceiling, its glass cracked but intact. It had never been turned off, not since the day it was last used. And then there was the sound, a whisper, not of wind, not of water, but of a voice calling from the dark, just out of reach. It wasn't loud, just there. You know, there's one thing that's never been explained. Not the bodies, not the tunnels, not even the sound of the wind. It's something smaller, something you'd miss if you weren't looking. But it's there, like a whisper in the dark. They found dozens of things, boots, belts, even a few pairs of gloves. But this button, no one knows where it came from. No one knows who it belonged to. It just sat there, like a silent accusation. Now, I've asked every historian, every ranger, every local legend. No one has a clue. Some say it's a trick of the light. Others say it's a message. But I think it's just waiting. Waiting for someone to look closer. And that's the thing, isn't it? You never know what's been left behind. Sometimes, the most important clues are the ones you don't expect. So, if you're ever in Carlsbad, I'd say you might want to take a closer look, just in case. You've heard the tales of the Carlsbad caverns, but what about the whispers in the dark? Some say the rocks remember, and the wind carries the voices of those who never left. Local legends say the massacre wasn't just a crime, it was a ritual. The men who died were taken for something deeper, something the caves still guard. It's not just the caves that hold the memory. The people of Carlsbad still tell the story, though they'll never say it aloud. They pass it on in hushed tones and wary glances. You might think the past is buried deep in the earth, but here, it's not just in the stone. It's in the silence, the wind, and the stories we keep alive in our hearts. You've heard the stories, but what if the truth is even stranger? No one knows exactly what happened that night, just that it changed everything. The official records say nothing, but the locals whisper about a silence that never fades. What if the caves themselves are still waiting to be heard? Even the most seasoned explorers hesitate now, not from fear, but from a sense that something is still watching, or waiting. The mystery isn't just about what happened, it's about what remains. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing is knowing you'll never know for sure. So when you hear the wind whisper through the caves, or feel the cold in the air when no one is around, maybe you'll think twice before stepping too close. You've heard the echoes of Carlsbad, but have you ever wondered what whispers linger in the dark, waiting for the right moment to speak? Sometimes the most haunting stories aren't told in screams, but in silence, the kind that clings to the air like the scent of damp earth after a storm. But for now, let the caves whisper their secrets to you, and let the silence carry them where they need to go. Until next time, remember that the dark is full of stories and some of them are still waiting to be heard. You've heard of Colorado's mountains, but have you ever imagined a hotel that feels like it's been frozen in time? The Stanley Hotel, nestled in Estes Park, isn't just a place, it's a legend waiting to be whispered. Built in 1909, it was once a grand escape for the wealthy, but now it's a place where the past lingers. Some say it's haunted by the spirits of the people who once called it home. The Stanley Hotel isn't just a building, it's a character in its own right, with stories that refuse to be forgotten. Some say it's a gateway to the beyond, and others say it's just a place where the memories of the past refuse to fade. So, what if you found yourself standing in front of it, with the wind howling through the trees and the silence pressing in like a secret? What if you felt the weight of something unseen watching you? Back in 1879, the Stanley family had a vision for a grand hotel. They wanted a place where weary travelers could rest and where the wealthy could escape the bustle of the city. But they also had a dream of something more, something mysterious. The hotel was built on the site of a former mining town where stories of strange happenings had already begun to circulate. The land itself seemed to whisper secrets, and the workers swore they heard voices when the work was done at night. The first guests arrived in the late 1800s, and though the hotel was luxurious, it wasn't without its share of oddities. Some say the ghost of the original owner, Henry Stanley, still walks the halls and that he's not pleased with the changes. But it wasn't just the Stanley family's legacy that shaped the hotel's history. The land itself, with its strange energy and ancient roots, played a role in the myths that would grow around it over the years. And so, the Stanley Hotel was born not just as a place of comfort, but as a place where the past refused to stay buried. It was a place where history, mystery, and the unseen all found a home. You remember the first time you noticed something wasn't quite right. It was early spring, the air still crisp, but the halls of the hotel felt colder than the outside. The elevator was acting up, stuck between floors, making strange noises, like it was trying to tell us something. You laughed it off, but the silence after was louder than the noise. Then came the whispers. You thought you heard them in the lobby, just before the doors closed. A voice, soft and familiar, calling your name. You turned, but no one was there. One night, you found a note in your room. It was written in an old hand, the ink faded but still legible. It said, "You are not alone." You laughed again, but your heart was pounding. And then, the first real chill. You were in the library, reading by candlelight, when the temperature dropped so fast you could see your breath in the air. The candles sputtered and died, leaving you in complete darkness. You know, the night of the fire, the whole hotel was like a living thing, breathing and trembling. People were running, screaming, and the smoke was so thick you couldn't see your own hands. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Fire TV Stick 4K streaming device. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. But in the middle of it all, there was one person who just stood there, staring at the burning building, as if she knew something we didn't. No one saw her run. No one heard her scream. Just like that, she was gone, leaving behind a child, a husband, and a mystery that has never been solved. So, do you think she made it out? Or did she stay behind, waiting for something or someone to call her back? And if she did stay, do you think she's still watching the hotel or waiting for the next person to come looking for answers? I've spoken with dozens of guests who say they felt the hotel's presence before they even stepped inside. One man swore he saw a flicker of light in the lobby, like a candle being lit in the dark. Another claimed he heard a child's laughter echoing from the elevator shaft, though the building was completely empty. He said it stopped the moment he left the hotel the next morning. One woman described a cold draft that followed her through the hotel, even though she had the windows and doors closed. She said it felt like something was watching her, right behind her back. And then there's the woman who said she heard a voice calling her name from the empty ballroom. She said it wasn't her own voice, but it was familiar. It was like the hotel was trying to reach her. These stories aren't just spooky, they're real, and they're still happening. The Stanley Hotel isn't just haunted, it's waiting for you to hear its story. We followed the trail of whispers through the hotel's archives, poring over yellowed newspapers and brittle photographs. Every document hinted at something deeper than a simple ghost story. One photo stood out: a man in a tuxedo, standing alone in the ballroom, his face frozen in a silent scream. The date matched the night the fire started. The fire records were even more chilling. They mentioned no cause, only a sudden burst of flames that consumed the West Wing in minutes. No one saw the fire start. And then there were the voices, whispers in the halls, laughter in empty rooms, and a faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves, like the hotel was alive. The deeper we dug, the more it felt like the hotel wasn't just haunted, it was remembering something it wasn't supposed to. You know, the one thing that's always bugged me about the Stanley Hotel is that missing sock. Not just any sock, this one was found in the lobby, folded neatly, like it had been waiting for someone to come back for it. No one knows who it belonged to, or why it was left behind. Some say it was a guest's, others think it was a staff member's, but no one ever claimed it. It just stayed. That sock became a symbol for the Stanley, a mystery so small, yet so big. It's like the hotel itself, holding onto something it doesn't want to let go of. And now, every time I think about the Stanley, I can't help but wonder what else is out there, waiting for someone to come back for it. You've heard the stories, but some locals say the hotel's true curse is not the ghost of a rider, but the spirit of the mountain itself. They whisper that the Rockies guard secrets older than time, and the Stanley is just a key. Some say the hotel is a gateway, not a tomb. The stories of disappearances? Maybe they never left. Maybe they're still here, in the walls, in the echoes, in the wind that howls through the trees at night. Theories abound, but one thing's certain. The Stanley isn't just haunted. It's watching, and it's waiting for the next story, the next soul, to be pulled into its timeless, unspoken pact. So, what do you think? Is the Stanley a home, a prison, or something else entirely? Maybe the real mystery isn't the ghosts, it's why we keep coming back again and again. Even now, decades later, the Stanley Hotel still holds its secrets close. Some say the ghosts aren't just stories, they're warnings. And the mystery of what happened to that poor woman in room 421, it's still waiting for someone to listen. The hotel's staff won't talk about it. They say it's too sensitive, too painful. But I've heard whispers of a woman who vanished without a trace, of a room that's never been the same since. It's like the hotel itself is holding its breath. The hotel's history is full of ghosts, but this one feels different. It's not just a story, it's a question that's never been answered. And sometimes, the silence is louder than any scream. So the next time you pass by the Stanley Hotel, maybe you'll wonder, what if the ghosts aren't just here to haunt us? What if they're waiting for someone to finally tell their story? You've heard the echoes of the Stanley Hotel, felt the weight of a place that holds more than just memory. But what if the most terrifying stories are the ones we never tell? Sometimes, the silence between the whispers is louder than the whispers themselves. And sometimes, the truth is just out of reach, like a shadow that slips away before you can catch it. So, as we wrap up this tale, I leave you with this. The Stanley Hotel is more than a place, it's a question that lingers, a story that haunts, and a mystery that refuses to be solved. But remember, my dear listeners, the real ghosts are the ones we let slip through our fingers. And sometimes, the most haunting stories are the ones we never finish. You've heard of the Carlsbad Caverns, right? Those grand, glowing limestone formations, the kind that make you feel like you're walking through a cathedral of stone. But what if I told you that beneath their beauty lies a darker, forgotten past? This place isn't just a tourist attraction anymore. It's a place where history lingers, where the echoes of the past refuse to be silenced. You ever feel like some places just remember? Now, decades later, people still talk about the silence that follows. The way the wind seems to whisper through the tunnels. The way the caverns seem to watch like they know something we don't. And if you're feeling brave enough, you might want to ask yourself, what if the caverns don't want to be remembered? What if they want to keep the truth buried, like a secret that's never meant to be told? You ever hear of a place where the rocks don't just hold history, they hold blood? Carlsbad Caverns wasn't always a tourist trap. It started as a secret, a place where men gathered in the dark, not for adventure, but for something far darker. Back in the 1920s, this was a mining town, and the caverns were rich in minerals, especially saltpeter, which was used in gunpowder. But what started as a lucrative enterprise turned into a nightmare that few remember today. You remember the first time you heard about the Carlsbad Caverns? It was just a place of wonder, a natural wonderland, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe. But there was something about those limestone halls that felt like they had secrets waiting to be unearthed. It started with whispers, stories of strange lights flickering in the dark, of voices echoing through the tunnels when no one was there. People dismissed it as the sound of wind or the imagination of the young, but some said the voices were not wind at all. Then came the disappearances. One by one, people went into the caves and never came out. Some said they heard screams, others claimed they saw figures in the dark. But no one could prove it. It was all just stories, right? Or was it? The local sheriff said it was a natural phenomenon, maybe a cave-in or an animal getting trapped. But the deeper you dug, the more the stories grew. Some said the caves had a will of their own, that they were protecting something or someone. And then, the silence. No more whispers, no more screams. Just the caves, still and waiting. Like they were holding their breath, waiting for the next person to step inside. Waiting for someone to listen. You ever wonder what happens to people who vanish in the dark? Imagine standing at the mouth of these caves, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something older than time. The silence here isn't empty, it's holding its breath. In 1923, a group of hikers set out to explore these caves, lured by tales of hidden wonders. But what they found was a place that didn't want to be found. Some say the caves themselves whispered warnings, though no one believed them. They never made it out. The caves swallowed them whole, or so the locals say. Some believe the rock formations shifted, closing off paths. Others say the very air turned against them, thick with something that couldn't be seen, only felt. No bodies were ever found. Just a few personal items left behind: old hats, a pocket watch, and a single matchbook from a local diner. It's as if the caves took them not as victims, but as something else. To this day, the caves remain a place of quiet mystery. Some say you can still hear their voices, faint and distant, calling from the dark. But if you're ever tempted to follow, remember some places don't want to be remembered. Some survivors claim they heard a low, mournful wail echoing through the tunnels, like a child crying in the dark. It wasn't just the wind, it was something else, something alive. One man swore he saw a shadowy figure dragging something across the stone floor, its feet scraping like claws against the rock. He tried to call out, but his voice just vanished into the void. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you enjoy, take a look at the Amazon Echo Dot 5th smart speaker. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. Another survivor described a strange light, not like fire or lanterns, but something cold and green, flickering like a heartbeat in the darkness. It followed them, always just out of reach. Some say the worst part wasn't the tragedy itself, but the silence afterward. The silence that lingers like a ghost in the places where people once laughed and dreamed. And then there are the ones who never came back. The ones who vanished without a trace, their names lost to time, their stories buried deeper than the bones beneath these rocks. The first clue was a rusted, blood-stained knife found near the entrance, its blade dulled by time, and something far more sinister. It was wrapped in a tattered cloth, as though someone had tried to bury the truth. The sheriff's report mentioned a struggle, but no bodies. That's when the real mystery began. Why would a massacre happen in a place that was supposed to be untouched by the world? The local historian, an elderly woman with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, said the caves had always been a place of whispers, not screams. She believed the silence was the real horror. One of the miners, now a widower, claimed he had seen a shadow in the tunnels the night of the massacre. He said it moved like smoke, and the air had turned icy cold in an instant. The final clue came from a sealed diary found in the remains of a collapsed tunnel. It was written in shaky handwriting, and the last page was torn out, leaving us with only a single word: forgotten. You know, the thing that has never been explained is the missing ledger, the one that held every name, every account, every life that vanished. No one knows where it is, or if it ever existed at all. It's like the massacre was erased from history, as if the people who died were never there. No records, no survivors, just silence and stone. Others claim the ledger was never found at all, that it was taken, or destroyed, or maybe even burned, but no one knows why, or by whom. So, what do you think? Was it a cover-up, a mistake, or something else entirely? Something that still lingers in the caverns, waiting for the right hands to find it. Some say the caves were never just a natural wonder, they were a place of blood and betrayal. You've heard the stories, but have you ever wondered if the locals knew more than they let on? Old-timers tell of a hidden chamber deep in the caves where the echoes of a terrible argument still linger. They say it wasn't just a murder, it was a cover-up. Others believe the caves themselves are the real killer, that the darkness and the silence have a way of swallowing the guilty and whispering their secrets to the wind. And then there are the tourists, the guides, and the park rangers who still swear they've seen something that doesn't belong in the caves. Something that waits. So, what do you think? Was it a crime, a ritual, or something even older, something the caves never forgot? You know, sometimes the worst stories are the ones that never end. The Carlsbad Caverns didn't just swallow lives, they swallowed the truth. And to this day, no one's sure what really happened. The local sheriff, a stoic man with a quiet grief, still keeps a small black box under his desk. Inside, a single photo, no names, no dates, just a face that looks back at you like it's been waiting. The local museum has a glass case with a single artifact, a rusted compass, its needle frozen in place. It's the only clue they've ever found, and it points, always, toward the unknown. You might think, after all this time, we'd have answers. But the caves don't give up their secrets easily, and maybe they never will. So, what do you think? Do you believe the caves still hold their ghosts, or did they just vanish into the earth, like so many others before them? You know, sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest echoes. The Carlsbad Caverns, with their silent stone and endless dark, seem to whisper secrets only the wind can carry. And yet, The stories we tell of disappearances, of lost souls often begin not with a scream, but with a silence that lingers too long. So, as we turn the page to the next story, I'll leave you with this. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not what you see, but what you feel when the lights go out. Now, let's go somewhere else where the shadows are deeper and the silence is louder. You've heard of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Christ was laid to rest. But there's another, older tomb beneath it, hidden, forgotten, and whispered about in hushed tones. Some say it's not a tomb at all, but a prison for souls too wicked to be buried. This crypt isn't just old, it's cursed. Pilgrims have reported strange dreams, whispers in their sleep, and a cold that clings to them no matter how warm the air. It's said that the air smells of something ancient, something wrong. The crypt has no official records, no official guide. It's a place that exists only in the minds of those who have dared to enter, and those who have entered have never come out the same. Some say they're still inside, trapped in the silence of the tomb. So, why is this place still here? Why does it still hold its secrets? And what happens to those who wander too close, too late? That's what we're going to find out. But first, let's step inside and see what lies in wait. You know, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre isn't just a place of worship, it's a place where history and sorrow entwine. Built in the 4th century, it was the first church ever constructed on the site of Jesus' tomb. Imagine the weight of that legacy, the centuries of prayers and whispers that filled those stone walls. But the real story begins with a man named St. Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine. She came from the east, driven by faith and a vision, and she believed she had found the true tomb of Christ. The church was built on her orders, and it became the spiritual heart of the early Christian world. Yet even as it stood as a beacon of hope, the church was not without its tragedies. One legend tells of a young monk who entered the sepulchre in secret, only to be found days later, pale and trembling, claiming he had seen a vision of Christ's ghostly form. He was never the same after that. The church took him in, but the haunting followed him to his grave. And then there were the pilgrims who came from every corner of the known world. They brought stories, relics, and sometimes their own secrets. Some left with faith, others left with curses. Some never left at all. So here we are, standing at the edge of history and mystery, where every stone holds a memory, and every whisper might carry a truth we've yet to hear. You remember the first time you noticed the air was different, like the silence had thickened and settled in your chest, heavy as a leaden shroud. It wasn't the cold, no, it was the absence of it, as if the place had forgotten how to breathe. The scent of damp stone and something older, something that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual smell of ancient buildings, it was more like the air had been holding its breath for centuries, and now it was finally exhaling, but the breath was cold and wrong. Then came the whispers. Not loud, not clear, just a murmur at the edge of your hearing, like the wind was trying to say something but never quite getting the words right. You laughed it off, but the laugh felt too loud, too sudden, like you hadn't done it. And finally, the touch. A light hand on your shoulder, just for a moment, but enough to make your skin prickle like you'd been burned by a candle that wasn't there. You turned, but there was no one, only the cold, and the sound of a door creaking shut, though no one had touched it. One stormy night in 1947, the crypt's iron doors slammed shut without a sound. No one knew how, and no one dared to leave. The church caretaker, Father Ali, was last seen entering the crypt with a lantern. His flashlight died mid-step, and the doors locked behind him. No one heard a thing. The next morning, the lantern was found on the steps, still warm. The doors were slightly ajar, as if someone had been trying to open them from the inside. The caretaker's body was never found, but his rosary was found in the crypt, still in his hand, as though he had been praying just before the doors closed. To this day, the crypt's doors remain locked, and no one has ever dared to open them again. Some say the caretaker is still there, waiting for the right moment to return. I remember the first time I heard the whisper in the crypt. It wasn't loud, just a soft, wet sound like someone breathing through a cloth. It came from the far wall, where the stone was cold and the air hung heavy with dust. One of the caretakers, an old man named George, swore he saw a figure in the corner, just standing there, head bowed, not moving. He said it looked like a man in a priest's robe, but the face was hidden in shadow. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something to enjoy, take a look at the Amazon Echo Dot smart speaker. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. A few years later, a young woman named Clara came to visit. She said she felt it too, an invisible presence, a cold spot that made her skin crawl. She described it as a sorrowful whisper, not of words, but of longing. She tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. She said it felt like the crypt was holding its breath, waiting. And when she finally escaped, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by something that had been waiting a long time. Now, I wonder, what did they see? What did they feel? And why does this place still hold its breath, waiting for someone to listen? We started with the old records, you know, the yellowed pages in the parish archives. The priest who ran the church back then, Father Marcellus, was a quiet man with a sharp eye for the sacred and a suspicion of the supernatural. He told us about the last mass held in the crypt, how the candles would sputter and die mid-prayer, how the air would grow colder than the rest of the church. It wasn't just the cold, it was the silence that followed. One of the volunteers, a retired nurse, insisted she saw a figure in the corner of her vision just before the lights went out. She described it as tall, wearing a white robe, but the face was obscured, like a shadow with no depth. The most chilling find, though, was a sealed envelope tucked inside the cornerstone of the altar. It was addressed to Father Marcellus, signed in his own hand, and contained only a single sentence: "The veil is thin, but it will not hold forever." We left the crypt with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the past wasn't staying buried. It was waiting, just beneath the dust and the stone. You've heard the stories about the Holy Sepulchre's crypt, but there's one thing no one can seem to explain. It's not the whispers, or the cold, or the missing coins, it's the way the stone floor seems to shift underfoot, like it's alive. You might think it's just the weight of centuries, but there's something about the way it moves just a little, like the floor is breathing. Some say it's the bones of the saints trying to escape, others say it's the devil's hand in the stone. No one has ever managed to capture it on camera, not even with the latest equipment. It's as if the floor is aware of being watched, and chooses to hide its secret when it senses eyes upon it. So here's the thing: you don't have to believe the floor is alive. But if you're standing there, and you feel the ground move beneath your feet, you'll wonder if you're imagining it or if the crypt is trying to tell you something. That's the one detail that's never been explained. And maybe that's the real curse: not the ghosts, not the cold, but the silence that follows when you realize there's something in the crypt that doesn't want to be found. You know, some folks say the real curse isn't the ghosts, but the way the church has kept secrets for centuries. Did you ever wonder what they're hiding in those ancient tombs? There's talk of a lost tomb, hidden beneath the crypt, where a royal family was buried in the 12th century only to vanish without a trace. Some say the church buried them alive. The church denies everything, of course. But when the wind howls through the broken archways at night, some say you can hear whispers in Latin or maybe in the language of the dead. And don't forget the locals who still claim to see a figure in the crypt at midnight, a man in a 12th century robe, walking in circles, never stopping, never turning around. Some say the curse is a warning, others say it's a prison. But one thing's for sure: the past isn't staying buried. It's just waiting for someone to dig it up. And still, to this day, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre holds its secrets close. No one has ever solved the mystery of the missing priest. Some say he was taken by the ghosts of the faithful, others that he vanished into the very stones of the crypt. The last time anyone saw him, he was walking the path of the Via Dolorosa, his robes trailing behind him like a ghost. He was praying, humming an old hymn, and then he just disappeared. Some say his voice can still be heard at midnight, echoing through the tunnels beneath the church. It's not a prayer, not a warning, it's just a whisper, a voice asking for help, or maybe for forgiveness. And so, the church remains beautiful, ancient, and haunted. It's a place of pilgrimage, yes, but also of questions. What happened to the priest? Is he still there? Or did he find peace in the very place he once feared? In the end, the church has no answers. It only remembers. And if you listen closely, you might hear it calling out, not in fear, but in longing for the one who walked its halls and vanished into its heart. You know, sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest whispers. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with its hushed stones and ancient air, seems to remember every soul who ever passed through its doors. And though the crypt may be sealed, the stories inside it are far from over. The echoes of the past still linger, waiting for the right moment to stir. Either way, the journey is just beginning. And I'd say, dear listener, you're in for quite the ride. So, shall we turn the page? Or would you prefer to stay a while longer in the company of the old and the forgotten? You've heard of the Carlsbad Caverns, right? Those limestone wonders deep in New Mexico, where the earth hums with ancient secrets. But did you know they once echoed with screams? In the early 1900s, a group of miners vanished into those very tunnels. No bodies, no clues, just silence and stone. The locals called it the Forgotten Massacre. But the real mystery isn't just what happened, it's why no one ever found them, and why, to this day, the caves still feel alive. So, dear listener, if you ever find yourself wandering near Carlsbad, I'd suggest you tread lightly. Some places don't forget and some places don't want to be found. You know, the Carlsbad Caverns weren't always a tourist trap. In the late 1800s, they were a wild, untamed place full of bats, strange rock formations, and a lot of mystery. But the real story starts with a man named John Wetherill who had a vision for turning this natural wonder into something more. Wetherill was no stranger to danger. He had been exploring caves in New Mexico for years, but Carlsbad was different. It was said to be cursed, and a local Navajo people warned him not to go in. But he was driven by a dream and by money. The final tragedy came in 1895. Wetherill sent a group of men, including his own brother, into the caves to map the way forward. They never came out. No one knew what happened to them. Some said they were swallowed by the earth. Others said they were attacked by something that shouldn't exist. In the end, the caves were left to the wild, and the tragedy was buried with them. But the stories didn't die. They lingered in the wind, in the silence, and in the hearts of those who dared to dream of what lay beneath. You remember the first time you heard the sound of the wind through the caverns, and you thought it was just the wind. But then you realized it was something else entirely, like a whisper, like a sigh, like a voice you couldn't quite place. The next morning, the same sound came again, but louder, more insistent. You thought maybe it was just the caves being restless, or the earth itself remembering something it shouldn't. Then you started seeing things, shadows that moved where there was no light, and shapes that flickered at the edge of your vision. You told yourself it was just your imagination, but your heart knew better. The locals started talking about it too. They said the caves had a memory, that they held secrets from long ago, and that if you listened closely, you might hear the echoes of what was lost. You began to wonder, was it the caves themselves that were trying to tell you something? Or was it the ghosts of those who had come before, waiting for someone to finally listen? You see it now, don't you? That narrow, winding path through the rock, the sound of your own breath echoing back at you. The silence is thick, like a wool blanket pulled over your ears. It's not just the caverns that feel abandoned, it's time itself, holding its breath. This place was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of wonder, but it became something else. A place where fear was not just felt, it was carved into the stone. You can almost hear the whispers of the past, curling like smoke through the cracks. The night they vanished, the caverns were still. No wind, no sound, just the hush of something waiting. The group was small, just 6 people, all experienced, all confident. But the rock didn't care about experience. It took what it wanted, and it took them. The last anyone saw of them was their lanterns, flickering like fireflies in the dark. Then silence. The caverns swallowed their light, their voices, their lives. No bodies were ever found, just the echo of their footsteps and the weight of their absence. I remember the day I heard this story from a woman who claimed to have seen the ghost of a miner in the cave. She said he looked like a man caught between life and death, with eyes full of regret and a face so pale it looked like he'd just risen from the grave. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40-oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. She said the ghost never spoke, just stood there, as if waiting for someone to come back and find him. And every time a new miner entered the cave, he would vanish into the dark, like he was being pulled deeper into the earth. One miner claimed he saw a child's toy lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. He said it was a wooden train, and when he picked it up, the train pieces crumpled in his hands like they were made of something fragile and broken. Another said he saw a woman in a black dress walking through the cave with a lantern. She never looked up, but her dress kept brushing against the walls like she was walking through the very bones of the earth. The miners called her the Witch of the Caverns, but no one knew who she was. Some said she was a lost soul, others said she was a warning. But no one ever saw her again after the first time. And yet, every year, some miners still go into the caves, chasing the promise of gold and the thrill of the unknown. They don't know what they're walking into, but they walk in anyway, like they're being called by something they can't see. We followed the trail of dust and whispers through the caverns, our flashlights cutting through the damp air like knives. The silence was thick, pressing against our ears, as if the stone itself was holding its breath. In one chamber, we found a set of footprints, fresh as yesterday, leading straight into the heart of the cave. It was as if someone had just passed through, and the earth had remembered. One of the guides, a retired ranger, whispered that these symbols were a warning left by the last group who disappeared, a message the cave had never let out. As we turned to leave, the wind outside howled through the cave entrance, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the earth, like voices, distant and pleading, calling from the dark. It was then we realized the cave wasn't just haunted, it was guarding a secret, and we had just been let in. You know, there's one thing that's always stuck in my mind, like a whisper in the dark. No one can explain why the bodies were never found. It's like the caverns themselves swallowed them whole, and no one's ever figured out how. It's not like they were ever really looking. The stories say they just vanished, like they'd never been there at all. But the caves don't forget. They keep their secrets, and sometimes they don't want to share them. So I keep thinking, what if they weren't even people? What if the caves took something else, something that didn't belong there? And if that's true, then maybe the real horror isn't what happened, but what was never said. That's the real mystery, isn't it? Not the bodies, not the blood, but the silence. The silence that says, we don't want to remember. And maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't. Some say the caves don't just hold stone and silence, they hold memory. And some say the echoes you hear aren't just whines, some say they're the voices of the lost. There's the tale of the Cave Whisperers, a group of miners who vanished in the 1920s, never found, never spoken of. Some say they were lost, others say they were silenced. Some say the caves are haunted by the souls of the victims, trapped in the silence of the stone. Others say the caves are just a natural echo chamber, playing tricks on the mind. But no matter what you believe, one thing's clear, the caves remember. And sometimes, they want to tell you something. You know, sometimes the worst stories aren't the ones that end, but the ones that just fade away. The Carlsbad Caverns didn't have a happy ending, and that's what makes it so haunting. No bodies were ever found, no graves, just silence where there should have been screams. And that's what keeps the mystery alive, not answers, but questions that won't let go. You think you've heard every ghost story, but some never make it to the page. Some just disappear. And that's what makes the Carlsbad Caverns story feel like a whisper in the dark. And you know what's stranger than the silence? That we are still here, still asking, still waiting for someone, somewhere, to finally say, this is how it ended. You know, sometimes the silence is the loudest whisper. The caves don't need to scream to remind us of what happened here. The bones of the past are still here, hidden beneath layers of time, waiting for someone to listen. But for now, let's let the silence speak, and the dark hold its breath. And remember, dear listener, the stories aren't just told, they're felt. They live in the spaces between the words. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a tale that's been waiting in the dark for a long time. You've heard of the Stanley Hotel, haven't you? That grand old place in the Rockies where the mountains whisper secrets and the snow falls like a veil over the past. It's not just a hotel, it's a living memory. Built in the early 1900s, it was meant to be a place of escape, a refuge for the weary and the wealthy. But the snow never lets go, and neither does the past. Some say the hotel holds on to those who never left. People say the hotel is haunted by the echoes of the people who stayed there, those who were lost, those who were forgotten, and those who never wanted to leave. And now, as the snow continues to fall, the Stanley Hotel waits for its next guests. But some say the real guests never check out. You ever heard of a hotel that was built on a ghost's wish? The Stanley Hotel started as a dream, but it was a dream that didn't quite end well. In 1898, a man named Henry Stanley came to Colorado with a vision of a grand hotel. He wanted a place where people could escape the world and find peace, or at least, that's what he told his investors. The building began in 1899, and it was no ordinary construction. Workers whispered of strange lights and voices, but they kept building, or so they said. When it opened in 1909, the Stanley Hotel was a marvel. But the real marvel was the people who stayed there and the stories they brought with them. But even the grandest hotels have secrets, and the Stanley Hotel was no exception. Some say the hotel was built on a promise, and the promise was never fulfilled. And that, dear listeners, is how the Stanley Hotel began. A dream, a promise, and a place where the unseen guests still wait. You remember the way the air felt that night? Thick and heavy, like the hotel had exhaled after a long, silent breath. The elevator doors closed with a sound like a sigh, and the silence that followed was louder than any noise. You turned, but there was no one there, just the flicker of a light and the echo of footsteps that hadn't been there before. It was like the hotel was watching, waiting, and you were the only one who could feel it. You remember the first time you heard the whispers in the hallways? They weren't loud, just a faint, layered murmur, like a conversation carried on the wind, just out of reach. Guests began to notice it too, as strange, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on a piano, but no one could find the source. It echoed through the walls, and the silence that followed was louder than the sound itself. The police searched the hotel for hours, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just a faint, lingering scent of lavender in the air, and a single, unopened letter on the boy's pillow. And then, the next morning, the boy was found in the hotel's basement, not alive, but not quite gone, just waiting. A ghostly figure, no taller than a child, standing at the foot of the stairs, eyes wide and empty. To this day, no one knows what happened to that boy. Some say he was taken by the hotel itself. Others believe he's still here, waiting for someone to remember him. I've spoken to dozens of guests who say they felt watched in that hotel. One man described a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, never moving, never speaking, just watching. Another guest claims she saw two figures in the mirror standing beside her, but when she turned, they were gone. The mirror is still there, just across the hall from the hotel's grand staircase. There's even a story about a couple who claimed they heard whispers in their room at night, voices that didn't belong to anyone in the hotel. They said the words were in English, but they didn't make sense. Some say the hotel has always been haunted by the people who stayed there. Others believe it's the hotel itself, a living thing with a memory longer than the bones of the mountain. We dug into the Stanley Hotel's archives, hoping to find a thread that tied the legends to something real. The more we read, the more we realized the hotel wasn't just haunted, it was a witness to something far darker. One file stood out, a 1948 disappearance of a woman named Evelyn Lyford. The last known photo of her shows her in a hotel uniform, smiling, but her eyes are empty, like she's already gone. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. The deeper we went, the more we found connections between the missing women and the hotel. It wasn't just a place of ghosts, it was a place where people disappeared, and no one ever asked questions. The hotel's history is a patchwork of secrets, and we were only beginning to stitch them together. Every clue felt like a whisper from the past, urging us to look closer, to listen harder. The mystery wasn't just about the ghosts, it was about the silence that followed. And sometimes, the most unsettling things are the ones that don't speak at all. You know, the thing that's been bugging me the whole time isn't the ghosts or the hauntings, it's the one detail that just doesn't add up. You ever notice how some stories have that one tiny crack in the wall, like a missing piece of a puzzle? It's like someone took a pen and erased a whole sentence, leaving just a blank space. No one seems to know what it was about. And here's the kicker, no one even remembers the article existed until now. It's like the hotel itself is trying to tell us something. But it's not the ghosts, it's the silence. The silence that's louder than any scream. And now, I wonder what if that missing piece is still here, waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Some say the hotel's ghosts are just regular folks like the woman in the lavender dress who vanished in 1927. Others think she's still here, waiting for someone to notice her absence. There's a tale about a man who came to the hotel with a suitcase full of money. He never left, and now his shadow lingers in the lobby at midnight. Some locals believe the hotel is just a resting place for the lost, those who never made it home or never found their way back. And if you listen closely, you might hear them, just a whisper, a sigh, or the faint sound of a door creaking in an empty hall. But don't look too long. You might just see someone who's never been able to leave. You know, even now, the mystery of the Stanley Hotel lingers like a half-remembered dream. Some say the lights still flicker in the old ballroom when no one's around. Others claim the piano plays itself in the dead of night, as if someone's still trying to play it. The hotel has a history of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths, but nothing compares to the case of the woman who vanished in 1978. Her name was never found, and no one knows what became of her. Some say she was taken by the hotel itself, that the Stanley has a way of swallowing people whole and never letting them go. Others think she's still here, just waiting for someone to find her. And so, the hotel stands, a silent witness to the past, holding on to its secrets like a mother holding on to a child who won't come home. You'll never truly know what happened to her, but you'll always wonder if she's still waiting for someone to come find her. You've heard the whispers of the Stanley Hotel, but have you ever wondered what it's like to sit in the lobby, the old chandeliers casting long shadows over your coffee cup? The silence there is thick, like the air just before a storm, full of stories, but no one dares to speak them aloud. And as you walk through those doors, you might feel the weight of 100 eyes, watching, waiting, remembering. But don't worry, dear listener, there's always another tale waiting just beyond the next corridor. And who knows, maybe the Stanley Hotel has a story for you too. You've heard of Alcatraz, but have you ever wondered what it was like inside the cell house? A place where the echoes of despair still linger in the stone walls, like ghosts of the men who once called it home. Imagine walking through the thick, cold stone of the prison, where the air feels heavier than the outside world, and the silence is broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood. This was more than a prison, it was a place of punishment, of isolation, and of despair. And now, it's a place where the past refuses to stay buried. You might think it's just history, but sometimes, history has a way of coming back to haunt you. And Alcatraz? It's not done with its stories yet. You know, the cell house wasn't built for the ghosts, it was built for the men who made the ghosts. It started in 1934, when the federal government decided to make a prison that could keep even the toughest minds in line. The architects were told to build a place where men would break, so they built thick walls, narrow cells, and no hope of escape. It wasn't just a prison, it was a lesson in how to break a man. The first prisoners were men like Robert Strasser, a bank robber with a silver tongue and a sharp mind. They called him the Prince of the Pops, a man who could charm a guard and still end up in the cell house. But it wasn't just about the prisoners. The guards, the warden, the architects, they all had their own stories. And some of them, well, they weren't exactly leaving the island with their sanity intact. So you see, the cell house didn't just house men, it housed the madness of men. And sometimes, the madness stayed behind, long after the last prisoner was gone. You remember the first time you noticed something was off. It wasn't a scream, not a crash, not even a cold draft. It was the way the light seemed to flicker just before the lights went out in the cell house, like the building itself was holding its breath. One morning, a guard found the door to cell 11 slightly ajar, though no one had been there the night before. The hinges didn't creak, not even a whisper, just a quiet, unnatural stillness that made the air feel heavier, like the weight of 100 unspoken words. Then came the rumors. Guards who claimed they saw a flicker of movement in the cells or heard a voice whispering in the dark. Not a voice like any human, but something older, something that had been trapped for too long. You wondered, could it be the echoes of the men who had been locked away? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had never been meant to be let out, and now it was beginning to stir. You know, the real horror of Alcatraz isn't just the prison, it's the people who were trapped inside. Some vanished without a trace, and others were lost to madness. But one story stands out, like a shadow in the cell block, lingering long after the lights went out. In 1942, a man named John C. Rutter disappeared from the prison. He was a civilian worker, assigned to keep the cells clean. The last anyone saw of him was him locking up for the night, humming a tune, as if nothing were wrong. They say he was trying to escape, but the cells were supposed to be locked from the inside. Some believe he was taken by the ghosts of the inmates who died there. Others think he went mad, or that he was never really there at all. No one knows for sure what happened to John Rutter, but the cell where he vanished is still sealed, and the silence inside is louder than any scream. You can almost hear him, humming just out of reach. And if you ever find yourself wandering the island at night, listen closely. You might just hear a faint hum, like a tune from a long-gone prisoner, singing a song that's never been sung before. I spoke to a retired prison guard who swore he saw a shadow move in the cell house late one night. He said it wasn't a trick of the light, it was something watching him back. Another visitor claimed she heard whispers in the empty cells, like voices trapped in the stone. She said it wasn't the wind, it was something speaking to her. There's even a sailor who claimed he saw a ghostly figure standing on the prison steps just before the gates closed for the night. He said it was a woman in a long dress with a look of sorrow. These stories are just stories, they're warnings. Some say the walls of Alcatraz still hold the echoes of those who were never truly free. The investigation began with a simple request to look into the past. But what they found was a labyrinth of silence, where the walls seemed to whisper secrets they weren't ready to share. They uncovered old prison records, but something about the dates didn't add up. The men who vanished were never officially declared missing, just forgotten. They found a prison doctor's report that was never filed. It described a man who had been kept in solitary for weeks, his meals brought in by a guard who never spoke, and who finally vanished without a trace. The deeper they dug, the more the walls seemed to close in. They found names that had been erased and records that had been quietly sealed away, as if something in the walls didn't want them to know. And then there was the final file, unsigned, unmarked, and written in a hand that wasn't human. It spoke of a man who was never there and a place where time had stopped. You ever wonder what happens when a place holds so much pain that even the silence feels like a scream? Alcatraz's cell house has a secret that no one can quite put their finger on, like a ghost in the attic you can't quite see. There's one detail, one tiny thing that's always been left out of every story. You know, the thing that makes the whole thing feel like a warning, like someone left a note in the walls that no one's ever read. You think about the men who were here, the ones who tried to escape, the ones who never made it back. But what if the real story isn't about them? What if it's about the thing that stayed behind, whispering to the walls, waiting for someone to finally listen? Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Apple AirPods 2nd generation. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. That's the one detail that has never been explained. Not in the records. Not in the stories. Just a question that lingers, like the echo of a voice you can't quite place. What if the prison wasn't just built to hold prisoners but to hold something else? You've heard the rumors, but let me tell you what the locals actually whisper. They say the cell house still hums with the voices of the men who were never meant to leave. Some say the ghost of a young sailor still lingers near the island, his cries echoing through the tunnels where the prisoners once ran. He never made it to the mainland, and he's still waiting for someone to pull him out. Then there's the tale of the Alcatraz hush, a supposed silence that falls over the prison at midnight. Some say it's the sound of the prisoners' final breaths. Others say it's the island itself remembering its darkest days. But the most popular theory, that the cell house is still haunted by a ghost of the man who built it, a sad-eyed engineer who never finished his work and died in the shadows of his own creation. So, as you walk those halls, remember this: the island isn't just haunted, it's remembering. And sometimes, remembering hurts. You know, sometimes the most haunted places are the ones you expect. Alcatraz's cell house has a ghost of a story, but the truth, it's still locked away, like a secret the island won't let go of. There are whispers of a man who never left and a woman who never came. The files are closed, the records sealed, like the island itself is trying to forget what happened. Some say the prison was never meant to hold men, that it was built for something else, something that still lingers in the stone, in the walls, in the silence between the screams. And now, as the years pass, the questions remain. Who was he? Who was she? And why does the island still hold its breath, waiting for an answer that may never come? You've heard the echoes of Alcatraz, felt the weight of its past. But sometimes, the most haunting stories are the ones we never finish. The walls remember. They hold more than just chains and cell doors. They hold the silence of the ones who were never heard. And sometimes, the ghosts don't want to be found. They want to be left alone, to rest in the quiet of the rock and the dark. So as you leave this tale, I wonder, what will you carry with you? A chill, a memory, or maybe a question you'll never answer. But remember, the stories don't end here. They wait just beyond the next turn, in the next room, in the next heart. You've heard the name, but have you ever seen the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Nestled in the heart of Jerusalem, it's where the world's faiths collide, and the past feels like it's still breathing. But beneath its sacred stones lies a crypt that whispers of secrets older than the city itself. Some say it's not just a tomb, it's a prison for something that never died. The air is thick with the weight of centuries, and the silence is not empty, it's full of something waiting. Some say it's the breath of the dead, others say it's the sound of 1,000 unspoken prayers. And then there are the disappearances, people who went in and never came out. You may think it's just old stories, but some of them were real. Are you brave enough to wonder what they found down there? You know, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre wasn't always the serene place you imagine. It began as a modest stone structure, built in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine, who claimed to have had a vision of the cross before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. But the real magic, or maybe the real curse, started with the bones of Jesus himself. The sepulchre was said to hold his body, and pilgrims from all over the world came to kneel, pray, and touch the sacred ground. The pilgrims brought with them not only faith, but also greed. Some claimed to have found treasures hidden in the crypt, others said they saw visions of the dead. And in the chaos, a few souls didn't make it out alive. One of the most infamous stories is of a monk who was said to have tried to steal the sacred relics. He was caught, but not before he disappeared into the depths of the crypt, never to be seen again. So while the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a place of peace for many, for others, it's a place where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the echoes of the lost still whisper in the stone. You remember the first time you heard the faintest whisper in the silence of the crypt, like the wind had learned to speak the language of the dead. It wasn't loud, not really, but it was there just enough to make your skin prickle and your heart quicken, like it was listening too. You told yourself it was the chill of the stone, but the cold was too precise, too knowing, as if it had been waiting for you. And then, just as you turned to leave, the whisper came again, but this time, it was louder, and it wasn't just the wind. You didn't run, you didn't move, you just stood there, listening, because something in your bones knew this wasn't the end of the story. You know, it wasn't the ghost that made the most sense, but the missing bell. For weeks, no one could find the bronze bell that hung in the crypt's small, dusty chapel. It was a thing of beauty with lilies and roses engraved in its base, but it vanished the night the priest disappeared. The last person to see the bell was Father Elias, the aging priest who had lived in the crypt for 30 years. He was known for his kindness, but the night he vanished, the bell was last heard ringing, as if in warning. The search for the bell turned into a search for the priest. No one had seen him for days, and his room was locked from the inside. The only thing left behind was a single rose, pressed between the pages of a Bible, and a note that said, "I've heard the voices." The bell was found weeks later, hidden in the crypt's sealed-off crypt, its sound muffled by the damp stone. But the priest was never found. Some say he was taken by the voices, others say he simply vanished into the silence of the tomb. And to this day, the bell still rings on the wind, just before the rain. Some say it's a warning, others say it's just the priest trying to find his way home. I've spoken with a few folks who claim to have seen the crypt's entrance glow with a sickly, greenish light at night. One man said it looked like a ghostly eye staring back at him, waiting for him to step closer. Another woman swore she heard a child's laughter echoing from the tomb long after the last visitor had left. She said it wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect from a child. It was hollow, like it was coming from the walls themselves. One man told me he once entered the crypt during a storm, and the air turned icy cold the moment he stepped inside. He said the walls seemed to hum like they were alive, and the stones were warm to the touch, even in the middle of winter. A nun who once served at the church described the crypt as a tomb that remembers. She said the air smelled of old roses and something else, something that made her feel watched, as if the dead were still inside, waiting for the right moment to speak. Some say the crypt is a place where time forgets to move. You might step inside, and when you come out, the world feels older, heavier. Like the earth itself has been holding its breath, waiting for you to leave. We spent 3 days in the crypt, armed with flashlights and patience. The air was thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One night, the temperature dropped so fast, it felt like we'd stepped into a different century. The walls seemed to hum, like they were alive and listening. We found old records tucked beneath the floorboards, yellowed and brittle. They spoke of a priest who vanished in the 1800s, and his final words were, "The dead are not what they seem." Then there was the sound like footsteps, but not quite. It echoed from the far end of the crypt, as if someone had just stepped into the silence. We left before dawn, but not before the door creaked open on its own. The wind had died, and no one was there to explain it. You've heard all the stories about the Holy Sepulchre's crypt. Its whispers, it's cold, it's eyes that follow you. But there's one thing that's never been explained, and it's been gnawing at the edges of every investigation. They found it in 1952, buried beneath layers of dust and time, a small, ornate iron box, untouched by rust. Inside, nothing but a single, folded piece of parchment, written in a hand that no one recognized. No one has ever found that room. They've dug, they've searched, they've even listened to the stones for whispers. But the crypt still guards its secret, and the letter remains an enigma, a ghost in the silence. So the question remains, did the priest know something he wasn't meant to? Or is the crypt itself keeping a secret that we're not ready to understand? I'll tell you this, whatever it is, it's still waiting, and it's not done with us yet. You've heard the stories, but let me tell you what the locals whisper. They say the church's old caretaker, Father Elias, still roams the crypt at midnight, muttering to himself in Latin. Some say he's cursed, others say he's just lonely. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. Some say the crypt is haunted by the spirits of the first Christians who died there. Others claim the curse began when a young girl vanished in the 1800s and her mother cursed the church with a prayer of vengeance. There's even a theory that the crypt is a gateway. Some say it's not the dead that haunt this place, but something older, something that was never meant to be disturbed. But the real mystery is this. No one has been able to find the girl's remains, not even the priests. They say the crypt guards its secrets with a heavy, unshakable silence. And that, dear listener, is why the locals still whisper, why the bells still ring at midnight, why the crypt is never left unlocked, and never fully explored. And so we come to the question that lingers unanswered, like a whisper in the crypt. What really happened to the last priest who vanished from these sacred stones? No body was ever found. No clue, no confession, no final words. Just silence, and the sound of the wind as if it were crying. The church has tried to move on, but the crypt remains cold, empty, and heavy with the weight of what was never solved. Perhaps the mystery is not meant to be solved. Maybe it's meant to haunt us, to remind us that some secrets are best left undisturbed. And so, the story remains, waiting, watching, whispering, just like the wind, and the stones, and the silence. You know, sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that whisper the loudest in the silence. And sometimes, the past doesn't want to be forgotten, it just wants to be heard in the right ears. So, if you're ever in the mood for a story that lingers longer than the night, you know where to find me. But until then, I'll leave you with this. The crypt doesn't forget, and neither do we. Stay curious, stay warm, and never walk alone in the dark. You've heard of the asylum of Sainte-Croix, haven't you? That crumbling French abbey turned madhouse, where whispers of madness and sorrow still cling to the stone like a ghost in the wallpaper. Once a place of prayer and healing, it became a prison for the broken and the mad. You can still feel the weight of those long-ago tragedies in the air, thick as the silence between the stones. The locals call it La Maison de Larmes, the House of Tears. They say the walls remember every soul that ever lived there, and some nights they still sing their sorrow. It's not just the stories that keep people away, it's the feeling. You can almost hear the silence, waiting for something to break it, and sometimes it does. So, What do you think? Is it just the wind, or is there something more? I'd say the walls have a lot to say, but they're not the kind to share it willingly. You know, the asylum of Sainte-Croix wasn't built overnight. It started as a modest clinic in the 1600s, run by a French physician named Jean-Baptiste Moreau. He was a man of science, but also of faith, and he believed in the healing power of both medicine and prayer. But as the years passed, Moreau's vision grew. He expanded the clinic into a full-fledged asylum, adding stone walls and iron gates. The building was meant to be a place of refuge, not a prison, but the line between the two was often blurred. The staff included doctors, nurses, and a handful of nuns who tended to the sick. But there were also those who worked in the shadows, men who believed in the supernatural and thought the asylum was cursed. They whispered that the walls themselves were alive and that they had been built on sacred ground. The asylum's history is a patchwork of healing and harm, of progress and pain. And though it was eventually abandoned in the early 1900s, the echoes of its past still linger in the walls, waiting to be heard. You remember the first time you heard it, just a whisper, like the wind through the trees. But something about it didn't sound right, did it? It was the kind of sound that makes your skin prickle, like the memory of a dream you can't quite place. People laughed it off at first, called it the wind or the old house creaking. But you know what they don't tell you. That sound wasn't just a whisper, it was a voice, and it was waiting for someone to listen. Then the whispers grew louder, not just in the wind, but in the walls. You could hear it when you were alone, in the quietest moments, just a voice, low and pleading, asking for help. And it never stopped. You tried to ignore it, but the more you ignored it, the more it seemed to follow you. You'd go to bed, and the voice would come again, not in the walls, but in your dreams. You'd wake up, heart pounding, not knowing if you were still asleep or if it had finally found you. And then one night, you heard it in the silence. Not a whisper, not a voice, just a sound like a child's cry, but not from this world. And when you turned to look, there was no one there. Just the walls and the sound, and the feeling that you were no longer alone. You ever wonder what happens when a place holds so much sorrow it can't let go? The asylum of Sainte-Croix was built to heal, but it became a tomb for the broken. You can almost hear the whispers of those who never left. In 1868, a young girl named Elise was taken in, her laughter the only thing that made the staff smile. But the asylum had its own rules, and soon her laughter turned to silence. Years passed, but the walls kept their secret. The asylum closed, and the building was left to rot. Some say Elise's ghost still lingers, trapped between the past and the present. You think you know the story? But the truth is, no one ever found her. And the walls still weep. Every night, they whisper her name. And every night, someone hears it. One of the most consistent accounts comes from a nun who claimed to hear the walls weep in the dead of night, like a mother mourning her lost children. She said the sound wasn't just a whisper, it was a deep, mournful wail that echoed through the stone halls like a ghost trying to be heard. He described it as a tall, thin figure, dressed in old-fashioned garb, moving with a slow, deliberate grace like it was walking through time. There were even reports of a child's laughter coming from the basement, but when the caretaker checked, all he found was a sealed-off room with a faded warning on the door. Some say the walls are not just remembering the past, they're waiting for someone to listen. We began our investigation with a simple question: what if the walls were speaking? We walked through the crumbling halls, expecting echoes, not whispers. The first clue came in the form of a diary, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words still carried the weight of a woman's fear. Then there were the sounds, low, guttural moans that rose with the wind. They came from the basement, where the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something older. We found a hidden room behind a loose panel, filled with old medical instruments and a single, rusted pendulum clock that never stopped swinging. The final clue was a letter, written in a trembling hand, pleading for someone to listen to the walls before it's too late. You know, there's one thing about Sainte-Croix that's always left everyone scratching their heads. No one knows where the sound came from, and no one has ever seen it. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a full, guttural cry, like someone in terrible pain, but no one was ever there to hear it. Not even the staff. Some say it was a ghost, others say it was a trick of the mind, but no one can explain why the sound never stopped, even when the place was empty. So now, every time someone walks through those doors, they hear it too. The wail, the cry, the one thing that has never been explained. You've heard the whispers, haven't you? The ones that say the walls still remember and the stones still weep. Maybe it's just the wind, but sometimes the wind sounds like a woman's wail. Some say it's the souls of the patients, trapped between the world they left and the silence they were never allowed to escape. Others say it's the nuns, who kept the patients in silence, and now the silence has a voice. There's even a theory that the wailing isn't from the dead but from the living, that the people who once worked there, who once cared for the patients, still carry the weight of what they did, and the walls hear it all. You know what's strange? The wails don't stop. They've been heard for decades, even after the asylum was long abandoned. Some say it's a sign, others say it's a warning, but no one ever says for sure what it means. And yet, the story doesn't end here. Some say the walls still whisper, not in French, but in a language no one understands, half scream, half plead. Have you ever heard a voice that doesn't belong to the living? The police closed the case years ago, but the locals still gather on quiet nights, hoping to catch a glimpse of the figure in the doorway, just a shadow, but it moves. What if the truth is still trapped behind those walls? Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. No one has ever found the body, but the rumors persist. Some say the woman was a patient who escaped, others say she was a nurse who stayed behind, and then there are those who believe she was never there at all. So, do you believe the walls are still waiting? Or is it just the wind that carries the sound? Either way, the mystery remains, and the asylum never really closed. It just changed hands. And if you ever find yourself walking past it at night, don't be surprised if you hear a voice calling your name. It might just be the walls trying to tell a story that's been waiting a long time to be heard. You've heard the whispers of the asylum of Sainte-Croix, felt the cold breath of the lost, and walked the hushed corridors where silence speaks louder than screams. But sometimes, the most haunting stories are the ones that never quite end. What if the walls don't just remember, they wait for the right moment, the right listener, to tell the story they've carried for centuries, and perhaps for the right soul to finally be heard. But I'm not done yet. There's another story waiting, one that lingers just beyond the edge of the hearth. A story that's not about ghosts, but about the people who, like you, are still listening. So, are you ready for the next tale? Or will you stay here, with the asylum, and let its voice carry you into the night? You've heard of the Grand Canyon, but have you ever wondered what lies beneath the earth, where the sun never reaches and the silence is louder than any sound? That's Carlsbad Caverns, a place where the rocks whisper secrets older than time. It's a natural wonder, yes, but there's a darker history buried deep inside those limestone walls. A history that's been quiet for over a century, waiting for someone to listen. You've seen the pictures of the glowing formations, the glowing bats, the glowing everything, but what if some of that light was never meant to be seen? What if it was meant to hide something far more sinister? The caverns are still here, untouched by time, but the story of what happened inside them, that's been lost to the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. You ever heard of a place where the rocks don't just hold history, they hold blood? Carlsbad Caverns wasn't always a tourist trap. It started as a mining town, and people who lived there, they had their own secrets. The town was built on the backs of miners, and the mine was the heart of it all. But beneath those limestone walls, there were more than just crystals. There were debts, disputes, and a whole lot of tension. The massacre didn't start with a bang, but with this slow, suffocating silence. People were killed in the dark, in the tunnels, in the very earth that had once fed them. And to truth, it's still buried. We don't know who pulled the trigger, but we do know the caverns have been quiet since. And some say, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of that night in the wind, in the stone, in the silence between the rocks. You remember the first time you heard about the Carlsbad Caverns, didn't you? Those glowing stalactites and the way the light danced through the rocks, so beautiful, so serene. But there's a story beneath that beauty, one that no one ever talks about. It started with a few strange reports, whispers of voices in the dark, the sound of footsteps where no one was. Then came the first real clue, a set of footprints, dry and cracked, found deep in the caves where no one had ever gone. The local ranger, a quiet man named Ed, noticed something odd. The weather had been unusually dry, yet the caves were dripping with moisture. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was holding its breath. Then came the first real scare. A group of hikers, all alone, reported hearing a child's laughter echoing through the caverns. No one believed them at first, but the laughter was real, and it stopped the moment they turned around. The local newspaper printed a story, but it was buried under headlines about the tourist season. Still, the rumors grew. People started to avoid the caves, and the silence grew louder, like the earth itself was holding its breath. You remember the silence, don't you? That hush that fell over the caverns the day the workers vanished, like the earth itself held its breath. They were just drilling into the rock, following the map, when the ground gave way. No warning, just gone. No screams, no sound. Just a void where people had been. They never found the bodies. Not then, not later. just the silence, the missing tools, and the stories that grew like moss in the dark of voices whispering in the stone, and I promised that the caverns would never let them go. To this day, the caverns are closed to tourists. They say the rock remembers, and if you listen closely, you might hear the echo of a man's voice calling for help deep in the heart of the stone. I've read the letters, the faded postcards, and the old-timey photos. Some say the caves whisper through the cracks in the stone, like a child's lullaby gone wrong. One survivor, a young woman named Clara, swore the ground shook like it was alive, and the air smelled like something sweet and wrong like burnt sugar and blood. Even the park rangers, who have spent decades here, say they've felt the weight of the past in the silence between the rocks. Some say it's not the caves that haunt them, it's the silence. And then there's the radio. In the early days, they said the caves would answer your call. But sometimes, the voices that came back weren't from the past at all. The truth is, we don't know what happened that day. But we do know this, the caves remember. And they're not done telling their story yet. We followed the trail of whispers through the winding canyons, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient secrets. The rangers' notes were sparse, but the silence between the words was heavy with meaning. At the base of the caverns, we found a rusted metal door half buried in the earth, its surface etched with symbols no one could decipher. It felt like a door to a forgotten world, waiting to be opened. We found a journal tucked beneath a loose stone, its pages yellowed and brittle. The writer spoke of strange lights, whispers in the dark, and a group of people who vanished without a trace, just like the ones before them. As we pored over the journal, the air grew colder and the silence louder. It was as if the cave itself was listening, waiting for us to uncover the truth, or to be forgotten once more. You know, the thing that really haunts me about this story isn't the screams or the silence, it's the one detail that has never been explained. No one knows what happened to the last survivor. They found his boots, half buried in the sand, but no body, no blood, no bones, just the whisper of something that was meant to be found. Some say he was taken by the caves themselves. Others say he never left, but no one has ever been able to find him. Not even the experts. And that's what makes it so strange. The caves are silent, the rocks are cold, and the wind has long since carried away the last echo of that night. So what happened to him? Did he vanish into the stone, or did something else take him? We may never know, but the caves still remember. You've heard the stories, but what did the locals really say? Some claim the caves whisper the names of the victims, and the wind carries their cries like a lullaby. Others say the bats are their souls, still circling the spot where they died. One old miner told me he saw a flash of red in the dark like blood, not light. He said it vanished when he tried to follow it, and he never spoke of it again. That's how the stories start, with a whisper of something seen but never understood. The most popular theory? That the victims were never actually there. That the massacre was a cover-up, and the caves were sealed off to hide the truth. But then, why did the stories still live on? Why did the caves still hold their silence? It's easy to believe the caves are just a place of beauty and wonder. But if you listen closely, if you let your mind wander, you might hear something else. A story that's been told for decades and still has no ending. You know, sometimes the worst stories aren't the ones we hear, but the ones we never get to finish. And that's exactly what's happening with the Carlsbad Caverns. The bodies were never found, the voices were never heard, and the truth remains a ghost in the rock. We're left with questions, not answers. And so, the story lingers, not as a warning, but as a whisper in the dark. A reminder that some places are never really empty. The Carlsbad Caverns may be a wonder of the natural world, but to some, they're still a place where the past refuses to stay buried. You know, sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest echoes, and Carlsbad Caverns, with its still, dark depths, is one of them. Did you ever wonder what lingers in the silence? The air down there is thick, not with fear, but with something older. Something that remembers. And maybe, just maybe, it's remembering you. But let's not linger too long in the dark. There's another tale waiting, just beyond the next bend in the path. One that promises the same chill, and maybe a little more truth. Quick word from our sponsor. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, take a look at the Stanley Quencher 40 Oz tumbler. There's a link and a QR code on screen right now, and in the description below. Alright, back to it. So, shall we step into the next story? Or will you stay here, in the quiet, with the ghosts of the Carlsbad Caverns? Before you go, if you enjoyed this, please give it a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell us in the comments what you'd like us to make next. We read every single one. Thank you so much for watching.